Sahana Vavatu, Sahanau Bhunaktu, Sahaviryan Karava Vahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Looks good. All right. Good. Welcome back to our ongoing class on the Bhagavad Gita. We continue our study of Chapter 4, and we'll begin, as always, with some recitation, beginning with verse 21, and be sure to glance at the meaning and then repeat after me. Nirashiryata chittatma, nirashiryata chittatma, tyakta sarva parigraha, tyakta sarva parigraha, shariram kevalam karma, shariram kevalam karma, kurvanapnoti kilbisham, Kurvanapnoti kilbisham, yadritchalabha santushto, yadritchalabha santushto, dvandvatito vimatsaraha, dvandvatito vimatsaraha, samasiddhava siddhaucha, samasiddhava siddhaucha, Kritvapi nani badhyate, kritvapi nani badhyate, gata sangasya muktasya, gata sangasya muktasya, jnanavastita chetasaha, jnanavastita chetasaha, yajñaya charatah karma, yajñaya charatah karma, samagram praviliyate, samagram praviliyate, brahmarpanam brahmahavihi, brahmarpanam brahmahavihi, brahmagnau brahmanahutam, brahmagnau brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina, Brahma karma samadhina, Daivameva pare yajñam, Daivameva pare yajñam, Yoginah paryupasate, Yoginah Paryupasate, Brahmagnava pare yajñam, Brahmagnava pare yajñam, Yajñenaivopajuhvati, Yajñenaivopajuhvati, Shrotradinindriyanyanye, Shrotradinindriyanyanye, Samyamagnishu juhvati, Samyagnishu juhvati, Shabdadin vishayanyanya, Shabdadin vishayanyanya, Indriyagnishu juhvati, Indriyagnishu juhvati, Sarvanindriya karmani, Sarvanindriya karmani, Prana karmani chapare, Prana karmani chapare, Atma samyama yogagnau, Atma samyama yogagnau, Juhvati jnana dipite, Juhvati jnana dipite, Dravya yajñastapo yajña, Dravya yajñastapo yajña, Yoga yajñastatapare, Yoga yajñastatapare, Swadhyaya jnana yajñascha, Swadhyaya jnana yajñascha, Yataya samshitavrataha, Yataya samshitavrataha. Good. We will pick up the thread. We finished verse 21. So we will start today with verse 22. And our context here is the nature of an enlightened person. This topic comes actually several times in the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna describes not how an enlightened person behaves, but describes how they think, how their minds work. And in particular, what is described as the radical shift of orientation when instead of being driven by raga and dvesha, you are now freed from the compulsions of raga dvesha and find total satisfaction, peace, and contentment in your own true self. Your true self being the source of contentment, peace, ananda. So this is described in several places by Sri Krishna as kind of a signpost. By seeing the nature of an enlightened person, we know the direction that we should all be going in towards that inner peace and contentment. So with that brief introduction, we'll pick up where we left off. Yadricha santushto, Yadricha santushto, Dvandvatito vimatsaraha, Dvandvatito vimatsaraha, Samasiddhava siddhaucha, Samasiddhava siddhaucha, Kritva pinani badhyate, Kritva pinani badhyate. So here the enlightened person is described as one who is, at the end of the first line, santushtaha, completely content, completely fulfilled. By what? Yad richa labha. By what is that? By whatever is labha, attained, yad richa. By accident. By whatever is obtained by accident means by whatever comes, without needing to chase after what you want, without needing to run away from what you don't want. Whatever does come or whatever doesn't come is perfectly okay. There's a nice metaphor that's used in many scriptures and commentaries where the enlightened person is compared to a python. I don't know anything much about pythons, but I'm told that they don't go hunting for their prey. The python will lay coiled up in a shady place underneath a rock, perhaps, and wait for their prey to come nearby. And only when the prey comes nearby does the python go and eat the prey. So the python is content with whatever comes its way, and if no prey comes, it just stays coiled up underneath its rock without having to chase after its prey. So that python is used then as a metaphor for one who is freed from the compulsivity of raga dvesha. That enlightened person is also dvandva atita. Atita, beyond, dvandva, dualities. And when you see that expression, beyond dualities, referring specifically to dualities like heat and cold, dualities like likes and dislikes. Most people, that basic duality, I like this, I don't like this, I like it warm, I don't like it cold, whatever it is, these are the dualities that are being referred to, and these dualities result in being driven by raga dvesha. In fact, raga dvesha itself is an expression of a duality like that. You chase after what you want, You run away from what you don't want. So in the absence of these likes and dislikes, in the absence of these dualities, you find complete equanimity. Equanimity here means being perfectly content with the situation exactly as it is. Now, please don't misunderstand this as a justification for passivity. We've discussed this before. We've said that the enlightened person, instead of being driven by raga dvesha, the enlightened person is driven by Dharma. Remember? We discussed this at length. So the enlightened person doesn't remain totally passive. When we say remains completely content with the situation exactly as it is, in that state of equanimity, that does not imply that the enlightened person is passive in any way. Because even though the enlightened person is content with the situation as it is, inner contentment is there, but if there is a responsibility to get up and act, absolutely the enlightened person will get up and act. After all, the enlightened person is already fully content and complete. The enlightened person has nothing to lose in getting up and acting. You might think the enlightened person is so comfortable in the chair. Why would they bother getting up? Well, Dharma. They lose nothing by getting up from that comfortable chair and engaging themselves in what needs to be done, fulfilling one's responsibilities. The enlightened person is also described here as vimatsaraha. Vimatsara in this context means envy. You look at someone else and you see they have something that you want, you don't have, you might feel envious. The enlightened person is totally content, totally fulfilled, therefore feels no envy. In the third line, the enlightened person is samaha, the same, and now break apart these words, siddhau, asiddhau cha. The enlightened person is the same siddhau in success, asiddhau cha, and in failure. So whether if the enlightened person is engaged in some activity driven by Dharma, if that activity is successful or if the activity is not successful for reasons beyond a person's control, whatever is the outcome of the situation, the enlightened person remains content because there's no attachment. Remember, our definition of attachment is emotional dependence. Usually we are emotionally invested in our activities, so that if our activities go well, we feel good. And if the activities don't go well, we don't feel so good. That's emotional investment. That's emotional dependence, attachment. The enlightened person is free from such emotional dependence. Kritva api, and even though the enlightened person is engaged in action, na nibadhyate, the enlightened person is not bound by that action. For the reason I just described, when conventionally we are driven by raga dvesha, there's a huge emotional investment in getting what you want and avoiding what you don't want. So therefore there is a karmic bondage, and here the bondage means you are bound to a life of suffering. You're bound to suffering, being compelled to chase endlessly after what you want. You are bound to a life of suffering by running away endlessly from what you don't want. You are bound to a life of suffering by failing to get what you want. You are bound to a life of suffering by being stuck with what you don't want. All of this is a bondage of karma, a bondage to a life of suffering. The enlightened person, being completely freed from raga and dvesha, is no longer bound to that life of suffering, to the suffering brought about by karma. Okay. Next. Gata sangasya muktasya jnanavastita chetasaha yajnyan yajñāya charata karma samagram praviliyate. Before we see the verse, let me introduce this next section. And we said the enlightened person is not driven by raga and dvesha. Before becoming enlightened, that person was driven, not driven to achieve worldly ends. That person was driven towards spiritual growth. As so many people say that even when you are on a spiritual path, you're still driven by desire. Absolutely true. Before you're on a spiritual path, you have a desire for all kinds of worldly things. After you're on a spiritual path, those desires for worldly things fade away, but you continue to have a desire for spiritual growth. It is a desire. But notice the difference. The desire for worldly things just leads to more. After you get one worldly thing, you desire another, you desire another. So that desire for worldly things has no end. But the desire for spiritual growth is a unique desire. It comes to an end. When you become enlightened, the desire for spiritual growth naturally comes to an end. You find yourself fulfilled, complete. You find yourself totally free from suffering. So it is a desire. So then we say before enlightenment, the person was driven for spiritual growth, and to gain spiritual growth, the enlightened, that person, that pre-enlightened person, if we can call him or her such, that person was engaged in various kinds of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice like what we're doing right now. We're engaged in the study of the Bhagavad Gita. Also engaged in other spiritual practices, engaged in prayer or various forms of prayer like puja, engaged in meditation, certainly engaged in meditation, and engaged in karma yoga, engaged in worldly activities with a prayerful attitude, as we've discussed so much. So that person prior to enlightenment was driven and engaged in various kinds of spiritual practices, engaged in various kinds of sadhana. We often use the word sadhana to describe spiritual practice in general. So now the question, which will introduce this next topic, the question is, after being enlightened, does the enlightened person cease to perform those practices? So before becoming enlightened, this person engaged in daily prayer and meditation. After getting enlightened, do you think that prayer and meditation continued? Why not? Why, if they were before becoming enlightened, if they were engaged in prayer and meditation and found it very helpful and very soothing and very pleasant, why would they give that up after becoming enlightened? Now there is a huge change. Before enlightenment, they were engaged in those spiritual practices driven by need, driven by desire. Here's the difference. After becoming enlightened, the person continues to perform the same kinds of sadhana, but no longer being driven by need, no longer being driven by desire. When I was at our parent ashram in the Poconos, Arsha Vidya Gurukulam, my guru's ashram, after they brought up their temple, he would go every day. My guru, Puja Swami Tadatmananda, would go every day to the temple and sit there and participate in the evening prayer session. Now, if he is enlightened, not if, he was enlightened, so why would he bother? I'm being a little facetious. Why would he even bother going to that temple service if he was enlightened? You get it. It's so pleasant. Why should he not? Why do you think when you get enlightened, do you become allergic to various kinds of spiritual practice? It's absolutely silly. So that's kind of what's going to be discussed here. Let's see this verse and you'll see how. Gata sangasya muktasya, gata sangasya muktasya, jnanavastita chetasaha, jnanavastita chetasaha, yajñaya charata karma, yajñaya charata karma, samagram praviliyate, samagram praviliyate. We're still talking about that enlightened person, the enlightened person who is gata sangha, the enlightened person who is free from sangha, freed from attachment, freed from emotional dependence, freed from being driven by raga dvesha. The enlightened person who is mukta, liberated, enlightened, free from suffering. The enlightened person who is jnana, avastita, chetas. The enlightened person whose chetas, whose mind is avastita, established in jnana, wisdom. An enlightened person is one whose mind is established in wisdom, one who always appreciates the true source of contentment and peace within. Now, when I say always appreciates, doesn't mean the enlightened person is thinking about it 24/7. You can't do anything 24/7. But better said, the enlightened person never makes the mistake of thinking that the true source of contentment is outside. Because whenever that enlightened person engages in any action or even any kind of thought, that wisdom the enlightened person has gained is always present. That wisdom bears upon all the enlightened person's thinking and behavior, and for this reason, the enlightened person never again makes the mistake of thinking that something outside is worth chasing after or worth running away from. The enlightened person never makes that mistake, being jnana avastita chetas, being one whose chetas, his mind, is avastita, is established in jnanam, in spiritual wisdom. So for that enlightened person, karma yajñaya acharataha. For that enlightened person, acharataha, the enlightened person who is engaged in karma, action. The enlightened person who is engaged in action again, not driven by raga dvesha, engaged in action driven by dharma, or to pick up what I said in the introduction, an enlightened person who continues to be engaged in various kinds of spiritual practice, various kinds of sadhana. So whatever action that enlightened person does, whether it is to fulfill some responsibility or whether it is to engage in some kind of spiritual practice, for that enlightened person, that karma, those deeds, are done how? Yajnaya. Yajnaya means for the sake of worship. And this is introducing, in fact, a very major topic that comes in Chapter 4. And that major topic is this: an enlightened person's deeds are performed with the attitude of worship. And that we'll see that explained very vividly in the next verse. But this is the theme. The enlightened person is one who recognizes that let me rephrase it. An enlightened person acts not driven by raga dvesha, but acts with a sense of inner fullness and contentment. That inner fullness, let me try to explain this. That inner fullness, that inner divinity. Inner divinity means Ishvara's presence in us all. That inner divinity, which properly understood is Satchidananda Atma, your true self. That inner divinity expresses itself as various kinds of action, performing dharma, fulfilling duties, being engaged in sadhana. That inner that inner divinity naturally expresses, that inner fullness comes out. That fullness expresses itself in all actions. And one way it expresses itself is by acting with this sense of worship. Worship not in a formal sense, but, it's better just to wait for the next verse. So hold on just a moment. In the next verse, Sri Krishna very beautifully describes what it is to act expressing that inner fullness so that your actions become a form of worship. We'll see that in the next verse. So hold off on that for just a moment. So for that enlightened person whose actions are a form of worship, whose actions are performed with that attitude of worship, for that enlightened person, karma samagram completely praviliyate, completely melts away. And here, like I said at the end of the last class, our conventional karmas, driven by raga and dvesha, bind you to a life of suffering. You get what you want, you're happy. You don't get what you want, you're sad. That's a kind of bondage that's inescapable through ordinary means. So here, for this enlightened person, karma, here suggesting that bondage of deeds which are committed under the compulsion of raga dvesha, those deeds samagram completely praviliyate, completely melt away. And the idea of melting away here is deeds not compelled by raga dvesha do not produce suffering, do not bind you to a life of suffering. So that bondage melts away, so to speak, for that enlightened person. bondage to a life of suffering, praviliyate, melts away. No raga dvesha, no compulsivity. Okay, now this next verse is a very important verse. Hard to say it's many verses are important, but this one in particular. Let's say it. Brahmarpanam brahmahavihi, Brahmarpanam brahmahavihi, Brahmagnau brahmanahutam, Brahmagnau brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina, Brahma karma samadhina. This verse is a metaphor, a very beautiful metaphor that compares the deeds of an enlightened person. The deeds of an enlightened person are compared to a ritual. In fact, not any ritual, but yajna. Yajna is a term from the Vedas that describes ritual sacrifice. A ritual sacrifice is where offerings are made into a sacrificial fire. So in North India, they call it havan. In South India, they call it homam. Means the same. They both are synonyms for yajna. This ritual of sacrificial worship is a metaphor. And here, the metaphor is that for the enlightened person, not being driven by raga and dvesha, your life is sacrificed to God. When you are freed from your individual agenda, generally we are driven by an individual agenda, and that agenda becomes manifest in raga and dvesha. In the absence of raga dvesha, there's no inner compulsion, there's no agenda. I have to do this, I'm going to do this. And if you're not driven by your agenda, then what drives you? Well, here, the metaphor suggests that instead of acting according to your own will, your own desires, you are now acting according to Ishvara's will. And I have to explain that term, Ishvara's will. We could spend an hour talking about this. We'll make it very brief. Dharma. Here's where we're going with this discussion. An enlightened person, instead of being driven by raga dvesha, is driven by dharma, as we've discussed. Now, driven by dharma, what is dharma? Dharma means conforming to the laws of the universe, conforming to Ishvara's laws. Here, we may not have discussed this before, but this is related to a root meaning of the word dharma. The word dharma comes from the Sanskrit root dhr, and dhr means to hold or support. Therefore, a very fundamental meaning of dharma is that which holds or supports the entire universe. That which holds the universe together, that which supports the universe, that universal order, what Puja Swami Tadatmananda called Ishvara's order. Ishvara's order, that order that holds the universe together is Ishvara's intelligence manifest in the universe. Again, forgive me for being a little bit brief. We've talked about this before. To explain this thoroughly would take a long time. So allow me to be a little bit brief. But to remind you of this very beautiful perspective, and that is Ishvara's intelligence is what gives order and structure and even meaning to the universe in which we live. And we can say, figuratively speaking, that intelligence, that which is Dharma, which holds the universe together, we can figuratively call that Ishvara's will. Be very careful. Ishvara doesn't have a will like your will and my will. Generally, human will is very fickle. One day you want to do this, next day you will yourself, you decide to do something else. You decide on one thing, you decide on another thing. Human will is very fickle. Ishvara's will is not fickle. Ishvara's will is expressed in a law of gravity. And Ishvara's will is that objects fall down. If Ishvara's will were fickle, objects would sometimes fall down, sometimes fall left, sometimes fall up, sometimes fall up. If Ishvara's will were fickle, Ishvara's will is not fickle. What I'm leading up to here is we can envision Dharma as being an expression of Ishvara's will, figuratively speaking. Ishvara's intelligence, certainly. Ishvara's will, figuratively. If that's so, to conform to Dharma, to follow Dharma instead of following Raga Dvesha, to follow Dharma is to conform to Ishvara's will. We discussed this back when we were talking about karma yoga, Ishvara arpana buddhi, offering of your deeds to Ishvara. We discussed this in some detail. And that's why I'm not explaining it in great detail here. So when you break free from Raga Dvesha, you're no longer driven by your will. You're no longer driven by your agenda. But we can say that you now conform to Ishvara's will. And you act according to Ishvara's will instead of your individual will. That's a kind of sacrifice. You offer yourself, you offer your life for the sake of Dharma. To set aside Raga Dvesha and follow Dharma is to offer your entire life unto Ishvara by conforming to Dharma, by conforming to Ishvara's will. And that is expressed here in this metaphor that compares the behavior of an enlightened person to a ritual sacrifice in which ghee and other things are offered into a ritual fire. And look at the metaphor here. Brahma arpanam. This is the attitude of an enlightened person towards action, comparing it to a ritual. So in a ritual, if you're going to offer ghee into that sacred fire, you need a spoon. We'll just call it a spoon. Ladle. It's often called ladle. So here, that ladle, that ladle that you use to offer the ghee into the ritual fire, the enlightened person is one who knows that everything that exists is a manifestation of Ishvara, including the ladle. So look at the metaphor now. The ladle that's used to offer the ghee into the fire, that ladle is a manifestation of Ishvara. Here the word used is Brahma, Brahman, the absolute reality. So that ladle used to offer ghee into the fire is Brahman. It's a manifestation of Ishvara, works a little bit better. But literally, that that ladle is Brahman. That ladle is a manifestation of Ishvara. Brahma havihi. Havis is the what is on the ladle. Here, havis usually means rice. Rice is often offered into that sacrificial fire. So havis, the rice that is in the ladle, is also Brahman. The ladle is Brahman. That which is being offered by means of the ladle is Brahman. And it is being offered where? Brahmagnau. It is being offered into the Agni, into the fire which is also Brahman. Brahmagnau, into the fire of Brahman, into the fire which is also a manifestation of Ishvara. It is that offering is made, and it is made by whom? That offering is hutam. It is offered by whom? Brahmana, by Brahman, in the form of this body and mind. Ishvara manifest in the body and mind. Look, this is wonderful poetry. So in that metaphoric ritual, the ladle is Brahman, that which is being offered is Brahman, the fire into which it's being offered is Brahman, and the one by whom it's being offered, it is Brahman. And in the third line, Tena, in this way, Brahma eva, Brahma alone, Gantavyam is reached in the sense of understood. This is the vision, the understanding, the world view of the enlightened person. It's all Brahman. In the Chandogya Upanishad, very famously, it says, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Sarvam Kalu Idam Brahma. Sarvam Idam, all this. Kalu, indeed, is Brahman. This is the vision, and Brahman meaning here manifestation of Ishvara. This is the wisdom of the enlightened person. This is the world view of the enlightened person. That enlightened person who acts how? Last line, Brahma karma samadhina. The enlightened person who acts samadhina, and here samadhi doesn't mean meditation. The commentator Madhusudana Saraswati explains samadhi here as Brahma Jnanam, knowledge of Brahman. So the enlightened person, samadhina, with this knowledge of Brahman, performs karma, which is Brahman. Brahma karma, karmas which are Brahman, the whole ritual is Brahman. So with this understanding, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, with this understanding that everything is Brahman, that enlightened person acts. Now, this verse can be taken at two levels, actually, and then we'll see a third right at the end. So the first level is an enlightened person's understanding of an actual yajna, homa, or havan. So the enlightened person would understand that the ladle is Brahman, the offering is Brahman, it's being offered into the fire of Brahman, offered by Brahman. Seeing that everything is Brahman, everything is an manifestation of Ishvara, with that understanding, with that worldview, the enlightened person can be engaged in that ritual. Then, metaphorically, by the way, this metaphor is going to be carried on into the next series of verses. We'll just begin it, I think, after we're done here. So that metaphor, that in the metaphor, this ritual, this yajna, this sacrificial worship, represents the behavior, the deeds of an enlightened person. Let's look at the verse now from the standpoint of this metaphor. So the ladle, with which you make an offering, that ladle now represents an instrument used by the enlightened person in the performance of a deed. So remember, this is the metaphor now. So we're done talking about the ritual. Now we're talking about what the ritual represents metaphorically. Metaphorically, the ritual represents the deeds of an enlightened person. And for the enlightened person, just as you require an instrument of offering, ladle, for the ritual fire, in the same way, an enlightened person engaged in action requires other instruments. What kind of instruments? Instruments like hands, instruments like mouth, an organ of speech. So just as the ladle is Brahman, here the enlightened person sees that these hands are Brahman. This organ of speech is Brahman. This mind is Brahman. This is what the ritual metaphorically represents this. So all these instruments are Brahman for the enlightened person. Brahma havihi, what is offered is Brahman. Right now, I'm blessed to be able to offer these teachings to you. So from this perspective, the instruments with which I'm offering these teachings are Brahman. The very teachings I'm offering is Brahman. And Brahmag now into the fire of Brahman, the one who consumes the offerings is Brahman. The one who consumes these teachings, so to speak, is Brahman. Who's consuming these teachings? You are, of course. And you are also a manifestation of Brahman. And all of this is hutam, offered by Brahman. So this whole body, mind, sense complex, it's all Brahman, a manifestation of Ishvara. And this is Brahma karma. This is the understanding of an enlightened person towards deeds. Karma, literal meaning of karma is deed. You know that the meaning of karma as what you get as a result of your actions, that's a secondary meaning. That's actually karma pala. We use the word karma as shorthand for karma pala. Its primary meaning is deed. So we're talking about the enlightened person's attitude towards karma. And the attitude is, everything is Brahman, sarva kalvidam brahma. So we've seen this now from first standpoint, from the how an enlightened person would see an actual ritual, perspective of an actual ritual. Then we saw it metaphorically, how the enlightened person would understand his or her own deeds, karmas. There's a third perspective on this verse, which is important to reflect on before we move on. This particular verse is very, very often recited at mealtime. Now, it's kind of excerpted out of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita itself is an excerpt of the Mahabharata. So first the Bhagavad Gita is excerpted from the Mahabharata. Now this verse is excerpted from the Bhagavad Gita and often recited at mealtime. And then it has a different meaning with regard to a meal. So here, reinterpreting this verse now as a mealtime prayer, Brahma Arpanam. Here now Arpanam means your spoon, the instrument of offering. Brahma Arpanam, your spoon is Brahman. Brahma Havihi, that which is being offered, which means whatever you're eating. Whatever you're eating is Brahman. So the spoon is Brahman. The food in the spoon is Brahman. And Brahmag now, it is being offered into the fire of Brahman. What is that fire? The digestive fire So it's being offered into that digestive fire, and it is being offered by whom? Hutam, it is offered Brahmana, by Brahman. You, as a manifestation of Brahman, are using the spoon which is Brahman to offer the food which is Brahman into the digestive fire which is Brahman. Brahmaiva tena gantavyam. With this perspective, your meal is transformed into a form of worship. You're worshiping Ishvara. You're worshiping Ishvara within your own body. If you've been in a place where there are very pious brahmanas, if you've ever dined with pious brahmanas, you watch them, and they have certain rituals they perform at mealtime, including sprinkling water around their food to purify the food. Why purify the food? The food is already pure. This is a ritual purification of the food before it is eaten, before it's offered. And then many brahmanas, pious brahmanas, priests, will take 5 small morsels and eat those 5 morsels one at a time with a particular prayer. Pranaya swaha, apanaya swaha, vyanaya swaha. These are the same prayers that are used by those priests when they offer food at an altar during puja. So the same prayers that are used to offer food at an altar, the Brahmana uses the same prayers as they eat the first 5 morsels of food. The point here is that a ordinary meal can be transformed into a very beautiful, prayerful ritual with the help of this verse and with the help of some of his teachings. So, for all those reasons, this verse is often recited before eating a meal. How are we doing with time? Let's just go on a little bit. Daivam heva pare yajnam, Daivam heva pare yajnam, Yoginah paryupasate, Yoginah paryupasate, Brahmagnava pare yajnam, Brahmagnava pare yajnam, Yajnenaivopajuhvati, Yajnenaivopajuhvati. We mentioned before that an enlightened person who, before gaining enlightenment, that person performed various spiritual practices, so that after becoming enlightened, they're likely to perform the very same practices, but with a very different, for a very different reason. Before enlightenment, they were performing those practices driven by desire for spiritual growth, desire for moksha. One who desires moksha is called mumukshu. Mumukshu literally means one who desires moksha. So we've said before, it is a desire, but that one desire is unique. That desire is okay. All the other desires are problematic. A desire for moksha is a good thing. As we said before, it's the only desire that finally comes to an end. So those rituals that were at first done for the sake of spiritual growth, driven by desire, after enlightenment, those same spiritual practices are done with this attitude of worship, with this attitude of sacrificing one's life and one's activities unto Ishvara, who is manifest in all forms. And so here, the next series of verses, we'll see just one. This whole, and goes on, I think, for about a half a dozen verses, different kinds of sadhana performed by different kinds of different spiritual, different enlightened persons. Different enlightened persons performing different kinds of spiritual practices, but all of them performing these practices not driven by need for spiritual growth, all of them performing these practices with this attitude of offering, with this attitude of sacrifice. So in the first verse, Daivam eva apare yajnam. Apare, others. Others means in addition to the enlightened person who looks upon that ritual, that fire ritual, as an offering, everything being Brahman. Apare, in addition to that person, others do daivam yajnam. They do yajna, worship, which is daivam, to the gods. The prior verse talked about offering into the fire of Brahman, and here is talking about other enlightened persons who may perform worship not into a ritual fire, but, well, actually, possibly into a ritual fire, but not worship of Brahman, as the prior verse suggested, but here, worship of devas, worship of various gods, whether the gods are Vishnu and Shiva and Devi, or whether the gods are gods of nature, like Surya and Agni, sun and fire, etc. So others worship the gods, and others yet, yoginaha, in the second line, other yogis, and here yogis means the enlightened ones. Those yogis, parayupasate, they perform meditation. We've said before that before enlightenment, if you performed rituals or if you meditated, after enlightenment, you perform the same rituals, you perform the same meditations, but with a very different orientation. Also, Brahmagna, breaking apart the words in the third line, Brahmagnau apare yajnam we have to connect all these words are scattered apart. Apare, others yet. We talked about those who worship the gods, those enlightened ones who meditate. Now, apare, others, and here others who are performing yajna, performing homa, performing havan, making ritual offerings into an actual fire. Apare, others, drop down to the end of the second line, others, upajuhvati, breaking the words apart, yajnena eva upajuhvati. Upajuhvati, they offer. So apare, others, upajuhvati, they offer. What do they offer? Yajnam. They offer their worship. Yajnena eva, through this form of worship, through making this sacrifice, they offer and in the third line, Brahmagnau, we saw that expression before, into the fire of Brahman. So here, Sri Krishna is giving the first three examples, there are many more to come, first three examples of enlightened ones continuing to perform various kinds of sadhana even after becoming enlightened, but with this wonderful attitude. Everything is an offering, all deeds, including fulfilling responsibilities, including eating meals. Eating a meal is worship of Ishvara. Waking up in the morning is worship of Ishvara. Teaching Bhagavad Gita is worship of Ishvara. Going to bed at night is worship of Ishvara. Everything is worship of Ishvara when one gains this wisdom. There's much more. We'll see in the next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve santu niramayaha. Sarve bhadrani pashyantu. Ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhaveta. Asato ma satgamaya. Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya. Mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.